organization, the Mighty Cholas. Anirudh Kanisetti in conversation with Ashwitha Jayakumar. Of course, as
Thank you all for all of your patience. I'm so excited to see such a turnout on a Sunday morning. I really appreciate you all waiting. I know it took a little while for us to set up, but thank you. It's a real honor to be here in Chennai talking about your history with all of you. Thank you, of course, to The Hindu for having me, and let's get straight to it, Ashwitha.
Absolutely. Like Anirudh said, it is absolutely thrilling to be here, to be talking about South Indian history in the great state of Tamil Nadu, which was once the home of the mighty Cholas. So I've been stuck into the Lords of Earth and Sea, Anirudh's riveting new book about the Cholas. And as someone who grew up here, I have to say that so much of our first encounter with history comes from school textbooks. And I work a lot with kids, and the thing with school textbooks is that they tend to dumb down or actually dry out history, remove all of the vividness and liveliness and character from it, leaving space for young historians like Anirudh to put it back into history. So I would like to start by talking a bit about how he makes the medieval world come alive. You read his book and you can smell the ghee in the temples. You can hear the sounds of the bells. You can hear the sounds of women chanting and singing. You can really bring that world alive before your eyes through his words. And I want to ask you, how important is it to you to make history feel that real and vivid to a modern audience?
Well, I think that's really the fundamental drive of most of my work. I began my foray into being a public historian through podcasting, and as I was making podcasts, I was constantly faced with this challenge of, when I don't have words or visuals to show listeners, how do I bring the past alive for them? And I still remember when we were making my very first podcast episode. It was an episode of Alexander the Great in North India, and we were talking about the last stand of King Porus against him. And I was chatting with the sound engineers who were doing it, and I said, can we have conch shells as the king's bodyguards make this last stand? And we put in the conch shells. I thought it sounded cool, but I didn't realize how cool until somebody was telling me about it much later. So this friend of mine was apparently cutting vegetables in the morning and listening to the podcast. And when he heard conch shells, he had never heard conch shells in a history podcast before. He almost cut his finger, poor chap. But I think that really brought home to me how important it is that to bring senses to life. We all experience the world through our senses. We make connections, memories through smell, through taste. And I think, of course, the people of the past must have experienced their world in the same visceral and vivid way. And so as I'm writing about the past, my challenge is to constantly ensure that the world feels alive. You are not just reading about these dusty and unimaginable figures. You're reading about people who are as complex and as vivid as you and me. And I want you to have a sense of the ghee in their temples, the sound of singing, the lowing of cows, the bleating of sheep, all the things that must have made their world so memorable to them, is also what makes them and their world relatable to us. And so, as you said, Ashwitha, it's fundamental to all of my work. I think that if you want to feel history, then really feel it, sense it.
Absolutely. As a fellow narrative historian, I cannot help but agree with you. And to go from that sense of realness, not just do you bring the physical or the material world and make it feel alive, you do such a fantastic job of taking us into the minds of medieval people in a way that I think, again, history textbooks really don't. And they sort of remove the personality from these human beings, and we forget that they were actually human. And I'd love if you could talk a bit about how you mine the historical sources for the emotions. You talk about the grief of a mother losing her son in battle. You talk about a woman leaving her natal home for a marital home where she's unsure and she's part of a political maneuver. You talk about you do such an admirable job of talking about the ordinary, the little person who's going to war, leaving his fields as a cultivator and moving towards the heat and the crush of battle. So how do you find elements of this? How do you find this humanity in sources that are famously not particularly, eloquent about these things?
Well, a whole bunch of different things I think led to me writing these characters the way I did. Um, for those of you who have read my first book, you know that actually begins with a battle scene. But battles are very glamorous and so on, but we very rarely get a glimpse of the people who are actually fighting. But you do get a glimpse of them in Sangam poetry. The poetry of the early century CE in the Tamil language has these extraordinarily emotive, emotional, guttural reactions to their world. It has examples of women grieving sons who they have lost in battle. In fact, I was initially planning to have the chapters of this book opening with different Sangam poems, but ultimately we decided that that might break the narrative flow. The second big thing that I think influenced this was actually reading Abraham Verghese' Covenant of Water. Now, as those of you who have read it would know, it begins with a child about to be married off to somebody much older than her, and she spends the night that she finds out, she spends this crying with her cheek pressed against her mother's, and her mother's cheek is also wet with tears. And I found that moved me so profoundly that when I was searching for a way to open this second book, instead of having this grand dramatic battle scene opening, I decided to instead have something a lot more human and down to earth. And I found this medieval lady, Lady Kokilan Adigal, as she's known in the Chola inscriptions, who was one of the wives of King Parantaka Chola. And she was not a Tamil woman, she came from the Malabar coast. And so there must have been a point in her life too where she was told that she was going to be marrying Parantaka, and she knew that she would never again see the people that she grew up with. And if you really think about how that must have impacted a person, how would any of us feel if we would never be able to see our parents again? I think that just really thinking about, okay, so here are these relatively dry medieval sources that are saying the formulaic things, but really think about the people behind them. Think about the kind of relationships they had. When a son is making a gift and saying that this is for the merit or religious merit of his mother, does that mean more than just the formulaic respect? Does it also mean a genuine tie of love? And there's so many examples of this. You can see entire retinues of people, not just the prince's parents, but also the prince's barber, the prince's massager, making gifts for the religious merit of the prince. And this obviously indicates a deep and emotive bond between medieval royals and the people that they were constantly surrounded by. And I think very often we live in a world where that is really post a Western interpretation of history, where it's this succession of great people who have shaped the past. But no one of us is really an individual in that sense. We are all shaped by the people who have raised us, by the people who love us, by the people who challenge us, by the people who push us. And of course, this has always been the case throughout history as well. So with this idea in mind, as I began to look at this enormous wealth of information that the Cholas have left us, I found that they are people as rich and complex as any one of us in the audience. And this is not just the kings and queens, but even the service women, it's even the soldiers that you can glean these ties of devotion. There's examples of commanders making gifts in the names of their dead soldiers, which is not just something you do as a gesture. You do it because these are men who fought alongside you, who died next to you. And these leave deep emotional scars, and these are expressed in the sources once you begin to look for them.
Speaking of people, one of the most fascinating people in this book that I've encountered so far, I mean, we all hear of the Rajaraja Cholas and the Rajendra Cholas and the endless succession of kings, right? But there were some extremely powerful Chola women. The most obvious example being the Queen Sembiyan Mahadevi, whom you devote quite a lot of time to in your book, and you talk a lot about her as someone who patronized temples and inaugurated this scheme of temple building as a way of reaching out directly to the people whom her son Uttama would be depending on. So could you tell us a little bit about Sembiyan Mahadevi and what sort of animated her project of temple building and what made it stand out from the temple building that came before it?
Well, a really simple way to think about this is that Sembiyan Mahadevi, over the course of her time as Dowager Queen, so this is when her son is king and she is essentially the Queen Mother, she's barely in this position for, let's say, maybe 10, 12 years. In this time, she builds 12 temples, and all previous Chola queens, who all had like considerable, time in the limelight, like maybe 20, 30 years even, all previous Chola queens tended to patronize only one temple. So you automatically have this remarkable person who clearly sees temple construction as a very important part of her public persona. And then, once again, because of this remarkable wealth of Chola sources, you can not only say that Sembiyan Mahadevi built these many temples, you can say, oh, in this year, Sembiyan built this temple here, and this is what she's saying, and then the next year, she's in a different place and she's saying something different in her inscriptions. And then you can begin to ask, why is she doing this? And if you map out her activities, you see that early in her career, when she first marries into the Chola family, she's maybe 13 years old. She's a very young girl who has come in from Malay Nadu, so probably from the Congo region. And she says that I am the daughter of the hill chief, and she really does not, we don't even know what her birth name was, because she's using Sembiyan, which is a Chola granted title. And the first gifts that Sembiyan Mahadevi makes are sheep. She makes two gifts. One is in the core of the Chola kingdom, one is in the northern frontier near where Parantaka Chola is fighting his wars. And in comparison, all the other daughters-in-law of Parantaka Chola are building temples. These are wealthy women who have like large treasuries, who have family workshops of sculptors to build large shrines. And Sembiyan is not able to do that early in her career. And you got to imagine that in the years that she appears and disappears from the historical record, ideas are cooking. She is talking to other women in the court. She's coming up with policies, ideas, and she's seeing the way that other women navigate temple building, how temple building helps connect patrons to devotees. And I think that really explains what she does once she is Queen Mother. She has this, as I said, once you look at her activities, her early temples tend to be mostly in the Kaveri Delta, which, as we all know, really is the heartland of the Cholas. But soon after that, she begins to expand into Nadu, which is the area around present-day Tiruvannamalai, and then further north into Tondai Nadu, so the area around Kanchi and present-day Madras. And generally speaking, the places that Sembiyan Mahadevi goes to are the places that are sung of in the poetry of the Nayanars, and they're also places that are important market centers. So why was this important? I think that it's because if you look at the inscriptions, you see Sembiyan will ask a merchant to be in charge of her temple donation. Or she'll say, the village assembly is going to be in charge of administering this gift of gold that I've given. On the one hand, of course, it is a way to appeal to the devotional sentiments of these communities, but more importantly, it's a way of incorporating people into the edifice of the Chola state, which is quite remarkable if you think about it. It is you don't really see any royals before her, especially in the Chola family, have this very clear and well thought out idea of how to build this popular support for the Chola throne. And I'm willing to argue that Sembiyan Mahadevi in many ways is the real founder of the Chola Empire as we know it, because she builds this popular support, she builds this tax base, and that's what enables her grandnephew Rajaraja Chola to go out on these extraordinary campaigns of conquest. If not for Sembiyan Mahadevi, if not for this remarkable woman who more people should really know about and talk about, there would not have been a Chola Empire the way that we imagine it.
That is so interesting, because I think so often in the history that we're taught, we invisibilize women and we don't really talk about how women were always behind the throne, pulling strings, making alliances and doing things in their own ways, right? And building connections between women. So I think we were having a chat earlier about how even today, we tend to think of women in power mainly in terms of rivalry. It's like if there's space for women, there has to be space for just one woman. But in fact, in your book, you make the argument that royal women, these multiple wives married to a single king, or mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law, nieces, aunts, grandnieces, they're all talking to each other, they're borrowing from each other, and this is a diverse cohort of women. These are not just women who come from the same region, but they're learning from each other, and they're also, there's a sense of like a common purpose. So can you talk a bit more about how these women built these connections and what in the structures that the Cholas have left behind actually show us that they were talking to each other?
Well, that's a really interesting question, Ashwitha, and I agree. Very often, how do we think about queens in Indian media? Generally speaking, they are either the damsel in distress who the big strong hero has to go and fight over, or they are these harridans who are manipulating the king to favor their son and to throw another son into disfavor, that sort of thing. But when you look at the court of Parantaka Chola and you look at the inscriptions that these women are making, you have this fairly remarkable circumstance where Parantaka Chola is married to 12 women, and we know this as a fact, but we never really think about what are these women up to in the Chola court. They are not just sitting around watching musical performances or dance performances. These are educated, literate women who are coming from a wide cross-section of society. They are not just princesses, they are also the daughters of Vellala gentry, they are the daughters of country magnates. These are women who have been taught to read, to write, to do mathematics, and who have a sense of aesthetics as well. Do we have the slides up on screen? Let me see if I can show you any of these images. Do you guys see a temple plan on your screen? No, not yet. If you could just have that up on the screen, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. Now, what you see is that, for example, it's up. So you'll see two temples here, and you'll see that one of them is the temple of the Irukkuvales. So that should have like a, if you look at the bottom part of the temple, you'll see there's all these small little carved lions and these beautiful little lotus petals. Do you see that on the lower part of the temple? No, it's too small? Okay, you see the mover coil? Okay, so just look at the base of the mover coil, right? And then look at the temple that's next to it, which is the Nageshwara temple at Kumbakonam. And you'll see that if the bottom of the Nageshwara temple is just these flat architectural features, right? But the mover coils thing is very heavily carved. Now, if you were to look at, so the mover coil is built by Nangai Bhuti. It's built by the father of Nangai Bhuti, who is a Chola princess. So the mover coil is built by her father, and if you look at her temple in Tiruchendurai, you will see that she has built it in the same style. It has the same heavily carved like lotus base with the lions. The Nageshwara temple is from the Chola home territories. So the Kumbakonam, one of their great capital regions at Parayarai. And you'll see that the Chola style of building temples is very different. They don't actually decorate their bases very much. So in these very, very fine details, you see these different lineages, these different sculptor workshops, these different family approaches to building temples. Now, the really, really astonishing thing is, so Lady Kokilan Adigal, who I was talking about a little earlier, she's not related to the Irukkuvales. She comes from the Chera family on the Malabar coast. And if you were to look at Lady Kokilan's temples, she actually has plinths that are carved in the style of Nangai's temples. So they are beautifully carved with lions and these petals, which is not something you see in Chera temples. So where did Lady Kokilan get this idea from? She must have got it from Nangai. So very clearly and demonstrably, you have a case where a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law are not rivals, but are learning from each other. And that to me is such a clear sign that it's been staring us in the face all along. We don't live in a world where women are always rivals. We live in a world where female friendships are a great mover of the economy and of society and of polity. And this was clearly the case for medieval ladies as well. So I hope that answers the question, Ashwitha.
Thank you. And of course, I think both in the medieval period and in the modern period, we don't give women and female alliances and sisterhood enough credit. But so to talk to move away from women for a second and to talk about the big guy, Rajaraja Chola. So clearly temple building and the display of devotion to a particular deity is a big part of statecraft, right? So how does Rajaraja Chola take from what his grand aunt was doing and build on that? The culmination of which we see in the Brihadishwara temple in Tanjavur. So if you could take us through that process of how this Prince Arulmozhivarman then eventually becomes Rajaraja Chola, what was on that pathway to becoming a great conqueror? How does he go from this younger son prince to being the Chola that most people encounter?
Okay, so just to give you a sense of this visually and just how remarkable Rajaraja Chola is, not just in Chola history, but I really think in world history. You can see those two tiny little temples on your screen, right? I'm now going to change the slide. Hopefully it works as dramatically as I hope it will. Has the slide changed? No? Has it? Oh, what a fail. How about now? There we go, okay. So you can see that the Brihadishwara temple or the Rajarajeshwaram or the Dakshina Meru as Rajaraja Chola calls it, is 40 times larger than any Chola temple that came before it. And that should give you a scale of just how much the Chola imagination has changed, the kind of resources that they're able to draw upon. And keep in mind, the Brihadishwara temple was built in 7 years. It's 130,000 tons of granite assembled in 7 years, which works out to about, I think, 7,000 tons a year. And on top of it, it had an endowment of 5,000 tons of rice that was supposed to come to it annually. 5,000 tons, you would need a fleet of 12 Airbus A380s to move it there. So clearly something has changed with the accession of Rajaraja Chola. And I would really argue that one of the big determinants of Rajaraja Chola's success is that he takes Sembiyan Mahadevi's temple policy of building all these little temples in different regions, not just in the capital region, and he amplifies it 100-fold. Over the course of his lifetime, he patronizes, I think, 40, nearly 50 temples, which works out to at least 2 or 3 every single year. So you suddenly see in the inscriptions this remarkable, determined, creative mind that is pushing these ideas and these gifts that he's sourcing through wars and diversifying them and sending them deep into the Tamil country. You also see that while Sembiyan Mahadevi generally tends to make a gift and then leave the locals to administer it, Rajaraja Chola also appoints his own officers to sit in the temple and to make sure the gifts are being properly administered. So you have essentially this twin engine model where he's going to war, he's taking these extraordinary tides of wealth and animals, especially animals, and he's then using temples to reinvest them. And so there's a very consistent effort to integrate the Chola state also with temple patronage and also with military expeditions. I'd like to pause at this point to thank a remarkable lady who helped bring these illustrations to life, Aurelia Frederick, Chennai-based architect. So over the course of many, many months, Aurelia and I worked together with the generous support of the MAP Academy, which is a Bangalore-based resource for the furtherance of knowledge about South Asian art history. And we were able to make these truly remarkable illustrations. And once again, just to give you a scale of a sense of the scale of Rajaraja's administration, while the Brihadishwara temple is built in 7 years, the Leaning Tower of Pisa, which is not even as tall as the Brihadishwara temple, took 200 years to build. Yeah, well.
I think you also point out that besides the pyramids of Giza, it is the tallest structure on the planet at that time, right?
It is. Once again, has the slide changed? Yes, no, no? How about now? Yes, yeah. So for the first time in this book, we have recreated what the Brihadishwara temple must have looked like. So, of course, all of us who have been to the Brihadishwara know that it's this spectacular structure now of this pinkish, red, orange granite. But in its time, the temple must have been painted. We know this from fragments of paint that survive on the exterior, but more importantly, from the interior of the temple, which is covered in these spectacular murals that show us what Chola temples actually looked like. Once again, Aurelia and I worked together on this for months and months to reconstruct the entire structure. And you can see what I find really very interesting about the architecture of the temple is this extensive use of corbelling. So the main superstructure, the Vimana you will see, is actually hollow. And simply because of the physics of it, you have this heavy capstone on top, which weighs about 80 tons, and you have these extremely thick walls that are able to bear the weight. And so the weight of this capstone pushes down the entire pyramid and locks it onto a stable base. And who are the engineers that were able to come up with a design like this? And keep in mind, they were building these really small temples before, and then when they're told that, look, you have to build something 40 times larger without experimenting with anything in between, over the course of 7 years, wham, they managed to figure it out. And I think that really emphasizes to me something very important about the medieval world, is that we think that medieval people were sometimes simple-hearted, simple-minded, but the brains that made this are, if you were to let them get their hands on calculus, they will be building skyscrapers. And that's why I just love this period. I find it so fascinating.
There's a wonderful description in the book of the Brihadishwara temple in the making, where Anirudh goes into all of the different people who would have been involved and how there was food being prepared for them and raw material being brought in. It's gorgeous. But so you've got Rajaraja Chola who is inaugurating his temple building project. He's injecting money that he's getting in from his conquests of regional areas that surrounded this Chola heartland. But when he dies, he has his son, Rajendra, come to power, right? And Rajendra, what must it have been like? And I couldn't help but think about how it would have been to grow up as the child of such a visionary, powerful leader. And so do you grow up with this complex of, oh, I've got to outdo him, or you're constantly pushed down by the weight of thinking, oh no, I've got to live up to this person's expectations. And we do see that Rajendra pushes the boundary of what the Cholas could do. So can we talk a little bit about Rajendra and his personality, his charisma, and the way you beautifully describe it, his incredible imagination, and the way that he does things that people would not have thought possible, but then he goes and does them. So whether it's going and bringing the waters of the Ganga or mounting an expedition to Kedah in Malaysia, what motivates Rajendra Chola?
I think because we live in a world that is so globally connected, we forget sometimes how remarkable the reach of the Cholas was. Like, okay, you want to go to Calcutta, get into a flight, fly for 2.5 hours, you're there. But it was not that easy in the 11th century to get to Bengal. And I think that to go back to what we were talking about earlier, about we got to think about the psychology of these human beings, right? If you think about the way that Rajaraja Chola was raised, he's raised in a court where women are very powerful. He's raised in a lot of ways. He grows up in the shadow of Sembiyan Mahadevi, and you can see how her personality, her ideas really influence the way that he rules. And of course, the same must have happened for Rajaraja's heir, Rajendra, as well. I don't think it is an easy thing to grow up in the shadow of a famous father. I think if you look at the current generation of Bollywood film stars, many of them are in the shadow of much more famous and beloved figures from their own family. And you can see that very often, I think it's a very human thing to want to be equal of, or in some ways to even outdo one's parents, to take inspiration from them, but also be greater than them in a way. And I think that to a great extent, this also really does influence Rajendra. Because the kind of expeditions that he's undertaking, going all the way to the Ganga, going all the way to Kedah, of course you see these poetic claims of Karikala Chola, for example, going all the way to the Himalayas and so on. But it's really in the reign of Rajendra in the 11th century CE that we have this state that is capable of and that has the logistical ability to send thousands of people all the way to Bengal. Any of us who have taken a long road trip knows that you've got to pack food. You have to plan for what you're going to be eating along the way. If your army of hundreds, thousands of people is going to be marching all the way up along the east coast, you have to make damn sure that the soldiers are able to feed themselves. And how must this have happened? I think that the answer to this is the Tamil merchant corporations. In my view, I think the Tamil merchant diaspora, the Tamil merchant guilds, are one of the greatest forces in the history of the Indian Ocean, and we do not understand or talk about them enough. These are guys who reached all the way to the shores of the East China Sea in the 13th century. They actually built a temple to Shiva on the shores of China. These are folks who served as tax collectors in Java, who had settlements in northern Sumatra. And if you think about it, of course Rajendra Chola would have a good relationship with them. These are people who come from similar social backgrounds. Merchants, in our minds, are these well-endowed people who are sitting at home making lots of calculations. But to the medieval mind, merchants were warriors. If you were to look at the inscriptions of Tamil merchants, they describe their great beauty, which is accentuated by scars all over their bodies. The gifts that they're making in like various Tamil villages are usually depicted with symbols of swords and scythes. So they're not only farmers, they're not only traders, but they're also warriors. So it makes sense that for a militarized society like that of the Cholas, merchants would play an important role not just in the logistics, but also in the actual arrangement and the planning of military campaigns. And that's exactly what you see in the reign of Rajendra. I think that the reason why he is able to even imagine these extraordinary and wide-ranging expeditions is because of his relationship with Tamil merchants. And I think it's very interesting that you don't see any other Indian king before the Cholas even able to imagine this, because none of them had that special relationship with the merchant diaspora the way the Cholas did. So it opens up new frontiers for the empire. I would really argue that what characterizes Rajendra's personality to me more than anything else is his ability to imagine, because he lives now in a world that is shaped by Chola power. He lives in a world where there's a Chola outpost in Sri Lanka. He lives in a world where Tamil merchants are harvesting pearls for the Cholas. He lives in a world where Tamil merchants are building temples in Talakad in South Karnataka. He lives in a world where Tamil merchants have connections to the courts of Sumatra, to the courts of China. And that's what enables him. It's this perfect coming together of all these factors. And he was the man of the moment. He was able to execute, imagine these kinds of things that had never been done before, and that no other king after him really had the imagination to do, quite remarkably.
That actually brings me nicely to this question that I have, which is, so often we're told that history isn't about great men, right? For the longest time, history was seen as the doings of great men. And then we moved away from that and we said, oh no, it's actually a combination of socio-political factors. It's things that might have happened no matter who the great man was or who the great woman was. But I also think that the more you look at the medieval period, whether it's, say, the Mughals, which is my area, or the Cholas, there is space for individual charisma. There are people like Rajendra Chola who people rally to, people want to embrace his causes. He is capable of doing the things that he does because of the relationships and because he's personally able to persuade people to do them. So what do you think about the role of individual charisma, the leader who brings people to his cause, versus the sort of conglomeration of socio-political entities and factors that create or make empire building possible?
I think you need both, and I think we see that in India today as well. It's charismatic politicians and the people who follow them, just as importantly, really do shape history. But the ways in which they do it are defined by the socio-politics of their times, defined by the media, especially of their times. So just as a charismatic politician today might have a mastery of Instagram reels, medieval Indian kings had a mastery of temple politics. And I don't mean this to them, there was no separation between religion and politics the way that there is for us. To them, to be politically powerful was also to be divinely favored. They saw it as a self-reinforcing cycle. And I think that's why it's very important for figures like Rajaraja and Rajendra Chola, whenever they make temple gifts, not only do they take great care to specify what the gift to the god is, but they also take great care to document the conquests. So you see in every year, as Rajendra Chola's Mekirti, which is the Tamil eulogy that prefaces inscriptions, every year it grows longer and longer. And under Rajendra Chola, the introduction to the inscription is very often longer than the actual gift that is being described. So he's got this like tremendous list of conquests that he claims, and I think it was very important for him to show that I am a conqueror. These conquests allow me to be a generous patron of the gods, and therefore you should follow me. And it's a politics that I think is recognizable too, but also very different from ours. But you really got to imagine, if you were in the same room as a Rajaraja or a Rajendra Chola, these guys' charisma, not just because of their abilities, their qualities of leadership, but because of their ability to imagine, it would have been like sitting in a room with the sun. You can imagine the gravitational pull of their charisma. Like you can see it really changing the course of history. If you were to look at the long durée, the grand trajectory of Indian history, all the big empires tend to be focused in river valleys. So you see, of course, many Gangetic empires. You see quite a few empires in the Krishna Godavari Valley. You see an occasional empire in the Indus Valley. But the Cholas are the only empire to rule from the coast. And they don't just rule for a decade or two. For 300 years, they're one of the subcontinent's dominant polities. And the reason for this is because of the personal charisma, this kind of gravitational force that people like Rajaraja and Rajendra Chola were able to exert on the tide of South Indian history.
I'm glad that you brought up rulers from the coast, because I want to ask you that vexed question about whether the Cholas had a navy, which is something that people have plenty of opinions on, and I'd like to know your opinion on it.
So, I started researching the book with the idea that, of course, the Cholas had a navy. That's what all of us grew up with, right? And we think of them as a thalassocratic empire. And if they didn't have a navy, how were they able to achieve these remarkable things in Southeast Asia? How were they able to send these expeditions to Bengal? But the astonishing thing is, if you look at the inscriptions of the Bridishwara temple, you have dozens and dozens of army regiments that are making gifts, but there's no navy captains making gifts. If you were to look at the wider spread of Chola inscriptions, there's many senapatis who are like army leaders, infantry leaders who are making temple gifts, but strangely, no navy captains. But the naval folks who are making gifts are merchants. They very clearly had ships. We have a lot of evidence of this in various inscriptions. We know from archaeology that not only did they have ships, but they had ships that were capable of transporting especially heavy materials. The remarkable thing to me about the Tamil merchant diaspora is that in Southeast Asia, they're not building with local materials. They're building with granite from Tamil Nadu. So these are heavy, heavy blocks of stone that they're putting onto their ships and carrying because such an important part of their personalities. And clearly, the ship that is capable of carrying tons of stone is also capable of carrying armies. And I think maybe the answer has been staring us in the face all along. Maybe the answer to the puzzle is the merchant diaspora, who, as I've been arguing and as I make the case for my book, are really a great force in Indian Ocean economic history. And I think that the ability of the Chola state to imagine this very new and innovative kind of relationship with the diaspora is really what makes it it's one of the many, many ways that make them so remarkable and impactful.
You do such a good job of taking kingship and rulership and empires, and you turn them into these symbiotic relationships between kings and their soldiers and their vassals and, of course, the merchants. So we're always very interested in the rise of empires. But you've also talked a bit about, in your book, how the decline of the empire and the sort of breaking up of the Cholas' conquest and their state has had a long-lasting impact on the history of southern India and our present day as well. As our final question, could you talk a little bit about what you say is tax evasion creating or precipitating the decline of the Chola Empire?
So I would love to talk about this, Ashwitha, but our audience has been waiting for so long and they've been so patient with us. So let's take a few questions from the audience, and if I get time, I'll be delighted to answer this. Yes, the young man up front.
So you're talking about how the Cholas control land in Bengal and in the Malay archipelago, right? So there'll be different religions and different cultures like Mahayana Buddhism and different cultures in Malay, Indonesian cultures. So how are the Cholas able to control all of this and reduce the unrest in all of these regions without any major rebellion?
What a fantastic question. A round of applause. Yes. That's a fantastic question. So, and I think you've touched upon something very important here. What's your name?
Shreyas.
So, fantastic question, Shreyas. So, now, when we think about kingdoms, we'd say, yes, the Cholas had an outpost in such and such place, but you really have to think about the mechanics of how rule happened, right? Now, if you look at South Karnataka, in Kolar, there's this beautiful little temple to the local mother goddess called the Kolarama temple. Now the Cholas went and rebuilt the Kolarama temple in their architectural style, and very interestingly, you see Rajendra Chola leaves an inscription there both in Kannada and in Tamil. So it's meant to be read not only by the Tamil warriors who are moving in the wake of Chola armies settling down in South Karnataka, but it's also meant to be read by the locals. And what he declares in this inscription is that the locals have to give a gift, both the Tamils and the Kannadigas have to give a gift of a goat to Kolarama. So through this temple policy, he is able to create a space for two rival groups to participate in a shared Chola ritual. And this is such a modern and remarkable way of thinking and dealing with diversity, is that he really wants to give all these diverse groups a share in the functioning of the empire, as it were. So I hope that answers your question, Trace. Thank you. Yes.
Actually, I was so impressed of your work on Cholas. And also, I would like to ask your concern. What is our hesitation to stop to explore much more kingdoms, like examples like Pandya's trade route to till Rome, and especially is like Chera's even example I would like to mention Chera king called Cheran Chengutuvan is unique worship till the Himalayas, and we have I hope we have lot of inscriptions available on name of Cholas. But what is the hesitating thing to explore much more kingdoms like Cheras, Pandyas, and much more northern kingdoms, etc.?
So I think that for this we have to thank our lovely friends in Delhi Publishing, who I think for quite a while forgot that South India has a lot of readers who are very curious about our history. But I'm very happy to say this trend seems to be changing. Of course, my friend Manu Pillai has been doing this for many years, and hopefully through our work, what we'll do is we'll open the floodgates to more young people like yourself to write these histories. And what fascinates me about history is that it's never over. You know, it is constantly being shaped, it is constantly being told and retold. And so I would say, write a book. I would say to everybody in the audience, if you can, please write about our past. That's the only way that we can really truly do justice to.
Is this working? Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah. So, I mean, like, I know we can't compare the kings of old to governments of today, but because these are elected governments and those, I mean, there is a whole difference. But still, today, if we elect a leader and he spends all our tax money on building temples and giving gifts, we're going to call him a terrible leader. So, what is the thing that they used for people to be that happy? They must have done some amount of, clean water and access to roads and more equality. For a day-to-day living, what was it, since they were spending so much on these temples, how much of their tax and revenue that they were collecting, which was not going towards their own wealth or towards the temple, where are there details that you have about what they were doing for people's everyday lives that kept people that happy?
Once again, a really fantastic question. Let me just answer this, ma'am, and then we can get to this. Okay, we have an add-on question here, if we can. Okay, so the question that ma'am has is, what do the Cholas do for the environment in terms of management of water and so on? And here we have, I think, this allows me to talk about one of the most remarkable features of Tamil society, medieval Tamil society, in that a lot of the water management was done by locals. You have assemblies in villages. You have the Ur assembly, you have the Nada assembly, and if you look at their inscriptions, of course, it will start with, okay, in the 3rd year of Raja Kesari Varman, we are doing this, but very often it's like, oh, we, the village assembly, have contracted these 2 brothers from this village to come and repair this bund, and we have raised this tax to do it. So there's very little reference to the Chola state necessarily. It seems that you have this remarkably decentralized situation where local communities are the stewards of their own resources, which I think is a very, very remarkable policy that I think could work quite well today as well. To answer your question, ma'am, about the popularity of the Cholas, I think it's important to remember that the modern state is a very, very modern phenomenon. The idea that a state's job, that a politician's job is to be responsible to his people, to provide us with healthcare, to provide us with education, to provide us with opportunities, I think is a remarkable development of very recent democracies. For a medieval state, the purpose was not necessarily to, if it provide all these things to its people, well and good, but the primary way that medieval people saw their world is that the gods must be happy. If the gods are happy, then rains are regular, harvests are regular, and so on and so forth. And therefore, the primary urge of a medieval state was to ensure that the relationship of the gods and the people was flourishing through the construction of temples. So it's difficult to be entirely sure how everybody in the Chola kingdom saw the kings. I'd like to point you to the dedication of the book, which is a couple of lines from this remarkable Sangam poet called Kaniyan Ponkundran. And he has this, he's one of the few Sangam poets who does not talk about love or about war. And there's a story that says that Kaniyan Ponkundran was asked, why do you not eulogize kings? And he gives this extraordinary answer where he says that we know that we are all just flotsam on this great river of life that can sometimes flood under great skies slashed by lightnings. We are all holding on to a raft and flowing on the rapids of life. And because of this, we are not amazed by the mighty, and more importantly, we do not look down upon the poor. And what a remarkable sentiment, what a remarkable idea. And I think that should emphasize to us that ancient and medieval people were able to see their rulers as politicians and to understand that there is something beyond merely the politics. There is something deeper and more human that links us all. I think that's an attitude that...
May I ask a question?
Well, if you read the book, you'll find out that it wasn't always the case.
Okay. May I?
Yes, ma'am.
No, I'm here. Over here.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Shaivism was very strong in the regions of their kingdom, of the Chola kingdom. And some of the, I think Rajaraja Chola or Rajaraja Chola saw himself as Shiva, Shiva himself in the sculptures. So what is this? This is a divinity that's this thing, a king. Is it a fact of of Hindu kings, or even Muslim kings of India? But what about the Cholas? Did they see themselves, and why?
Well, it's difficult to be completely sure because we don't have Rajaraja Chola's personal diary. So we don't really know what he personally thought. But what we can see is what's in his inscriptions. And what's quite interesting to me is that the Sanskrit term for Rajaraja, Lord Rajaraja Ishwara, is the same as the Sanskrit term for Rajaraja's Lord, Rajarajeshwara. And whether or not personally Rajaraja saw himself as related to Shiva in some form, if you look at the text of the Shaiva Siddhantins, which was the preferred religious order of the Chola kings, you have these remarkable proclamations like a king who builds a temple like Meru will remain like Shiva after his death. And we have to remember the theology of Hinduism today, as my friend Manu Pillai has argued, the way that Hinduism works today is not the same as it worked 1,000 years ago. Of course, all religions evolve. And in Shaiva Siddhanta, there's this clear idea that those who are freed by Shiva from the fetters of existence, after their death become a Shiva, not the Parama Shiva, but a being similar to him that is similarly beyond the troubles of the world. And it's certainly not impossible that some medieval Indian kings saw themselves in this way. We know that, for example, the kings of Angkor in Cambodia called themselves Devaraja. They were worshipped as lingas after their death. We cannot be equally sure if this was the case for the Cholas, but I think we should be open to the idea that their religion was, while the ancestor of our religion, was not exactly the same. So I hope that answers the question.
Hi, Anirudh.
Yes, sir.
I have a two-part question.
Oh.
So the first one
Just one, please.
is, both are pretty small, if I'm right. So they were an imperial power after all. So from the oppressed point of view, a lot of solidification of the caste system took place under the imperial Cholas. So what do you think from the subaltern view? What would be the view of the oppressed of the Chola history? The second question is, don't you think we are romanticizing too much of the Cholas being them being an imperial power?
Once again, a fantastic. I love the audience. What fantastic questions. I think that yes, it is important to keep the subaltern view of history, and I do talk about this quite extensively in the second part of the book when the sources become more diverse. So not only are kings making gifts, but also people from the country gentry. And you see this tragic situation in the late 12th, early 13th centuries when there's a mounting agrarian crisis, and it's partially a result of tax evasion that Ashwitha was talking about. But essentially what happens is that because a pre-modern state doesn't have the same understanding of economics as modern states do, it is not able to rein in its wealthy beyond a certain point. So you do see Chola generals, for example, not just doing tax evasion, but actually buying up lands from villages that are under agrarian distress, which leads to really tragic consequences for the people on the ground. And this, of course, forms the caste system as we understand in a really fundamental way. Now, I wish I could give you a more detailed answer, but I'm going to also request you all to buy the book, so I can't tell you everything about the book. Thank you.